We believe brain health is a human right. We believe it's a social and economic imperative. At ABI, we're democratizing global brain health by giving people access to the best minds and evidence-based information from around the world. Together, we are distilling complex science and turning it into actionable knowledge for everyone, everywhere. Will you join us?
And welcome all of you to Aspen Brain Institute's 2021 Expert Series. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Drew Ramsey, nutritional psychiatrist and very special friend of the Aspen Brain Institute. Dr. Ramsey is a physician, author, and rarely do I get to say the following, farmer. I would refer you to his bio on our website for full details, as we do not want to take away any precious moments now from what we know will be a compelling and valuable presentation. Assistant clinical professor at Columbia University, Drew released his fourth book, Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety, merely a few weeks ago, and its message will be the focus of much of our discussion today. So welcome back, Dr. Drew Ramsey, to our expert series.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. It's such a treat to be here with you and with the Aspen Brain Institute. And hello, everybody who's tuning in from wherever you are. Ronnie, thanks so much for showing off my new book. I'm really delighted to speak with you tonight or today about nutritional psychiatry and about the science that informs my new book. And so I'm just going to get my slides up here for everyone. And let's think about nutritional psychiatry. Now, this is a new idea, this idea that we and you can feed your mental health. And what I love about that idea as a psychiatrist and as people interested in taking care of our brains is it allows us to get into the prevention world. It allows us to think about each day and the opportunities that are in front of us as people with this really amazing gift, right? We won the lottery. We all got human brains. And so how we take care of them really is something that increasingly I think most of us want to take responsibility for. Now, we know this old adage, you are what you eat. And so these are, this probably isn't a very funny slide in 2021 because you kind of look at this and you're like, look, it could happen, right? Maybe, so just don't even joke. But of course you feel great. These things are loaded with antidepressants. And so quickly, my disclosures, I'm on the editorial board at Medscape Psychiatry and on the advisory board for Men's Health magazine. I am an author, so I'm going to present some evidence, but I want you to look at everything I say with a little bit of skepticism. I write diet books after all, people. And then I'm not going to discuss any off-label medications, but I am probably going to try and convince you that food is medicine. And I'm going to try and do that with a set of evidence quite quickly and efficiently to help really, I hope, get you up to speed. Now, these are the books that I've written, and all of these books are about mental health and food, because that's really been my interest. Now, part of that is where I'm from, and actually, I'm talking to you. If I turned my camera a little bit, this is literally what you would see, although the hay hasn't come in that nice yet, of course. This is my front field in rural Indiana, where my parents moved as part of the Back to the Land movement in the 1970s. And so really, I'm what happens when you take like an Indiana farm boy and you like mash it up with a Manhattan psychiatrist. And New York City is really where I've learned to be a psychiatrist and really in a lot of ways intellectually where I still call home, but I've had this wonderful existence to both be on the farm and be in the city for maybe the last 4 or 5 years of my career. And it's been fascinating to see how we're starting to think about food, this trend that started maybe, let's say 10 or 15 years ago. We care about farm to table. We care, where did food come from? We think about maybe should our food be organic, or how are these nutrients affecting my health? And we want to then, of course, extend that conversation about food and health to mental health. And this is really the connection that for the first time is being made in a significant way, because so often we think about food, we think about heart health, we think about cancer, but we don't think about depression, anxiety, dementia. And we need to, because mental health disorders are the top cause of disability. So often we focus on mortality, what kills us. That's important, of course, but we want to focus on disability. What takes us from our A game? What takes us from really working, as I think about it, as like the top of my license as a human being? Really creative, really energetic, really loving, making lots of connections. So that is why mental illness is such a drag on the global economy and the world economy. This is, I've joked really for about a year now, this is my least favorite slide because I hate the statistic and I think it's wrong. And I put it up just to encourage you to no longer use the statistic. Because what this suggests is like 1 in 5 of you, 1 in 5 of us, right, struggle with our mental health. And hopefully you don't become one of those horrible 20%. And I don't think that's true. I think 100% of our families, for sure, have some sort of mental health concern. Everybody watching this, there's someone in your family. I think 100% of us have struggled with our mental health at some point in our lives, whether that's our mood, whether we met criteria for a diagnosis or not. The reality is 5 out of 5 of us have human brains. And human brains, they're a little funky, they're a little fragile, really lovely, but there's a certain way that we should care of them that hasn't been emphasized. And right now we have this model, we take care of them when they break, but that doesn't really work for us either, because 60% of people don't seek treatment. When we think about just men, about 80% of men who have mental health concerns don't seek treatment, and neither do we get help for our kids. So we really want to think, how can we minimize the number of people who are getting mental health disorders? How can we get into the prevention business? And we started doing that via food. This is 2016, so 5 years ago, we start really seeing this push both within the wellness space and in the media, but also within the science around how mental health and food are connected. Now, if you're watching this and thinking, I really wonder when this guy's going to tell me what to eat, I just want to go ahead and give it to you. These are the power players from my new book, Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety. And it's not that I think you only need to eat these foods, or if you don't like these foods or have an allergy to these foods, that you should try them again. It's that these foods are archetypal examples of their food category. And I'll get more into that. But as I talk today about the evidence, I want you to think about these foods, the olive oil, the wild salmon, the dark chocolate, and why I'm recommending them to you, because it's so important to me that you see the evidence and the thinking behind these recommendations. Now, your brain is very hungry. We want to really reorient. There's one reorientation I want you to make tonight. Besides those foods that I think are great, it's that I want you to really start thinking about how to nourish your brain is your primary directive when it comes to nutrition. We've had so many other things that kind of grab our attention: heart disease, how we look in our swimsuit, the latest diet craze that we should only drink a certain juice or go into ketosis. And those are all interesting ideas. I encourage you as an eater to explore what works for you. But the bottom line is your brain is a hungry beast. Those neurons, they eat more of your food than any other set of cells, 20% of your calories in very high concentrations. You have much more vitamin B9 in your cerebral spinal fluid than you do in your blood. You have many more omega-3 fats in your brain cells than really any other cell in your body. Your brain is mostly fat, which just gives us a kind of little indication that foods and molecules that take care of fats might be good for us to eat. And there are lots of these polyunsaturated fatty acids in your brain. That's what omega-6 and omega-3 fats are. We'll talk more about those in a few minutes. I use this phrase nutritional psychiatry, and that is a new emerging field within mental health. It's great for me now because 10 years ago when I started this, it was like, there were no definitions, and there wasn't really much in the literature. And now if you go into PubMed and you put in nutritional psychiatry, stuff comes up. It's been really wonderful. It's the use of nutrition to optimize brain health and to treat and prevent mental health disorders. And as I mentioned earlier, what I love about it is both how it gives me a treatment tool. I'm a clinician, I see patients every week. It gives me a really positive treatment tool that empowers my patients. That's something that I myself am thinking about and struggling with as an eater, trying to do a little better at. And it gets me in the prevention business, that if my patients are well, these are some ways that I can help maintain them staying well. And if my patients or people who seek my help haven't really had maybe significant mental health episodes, we can begin to help them design lifestyle choices like diet and exercise that the research suggests will really help them avoid these illnesses. Now, just a few high-level concepts. I'm sure everybody at the Aspen Brain Institute has heard of these ideas, but I just want to put them in the context of mental health. Let's stop thinking about just serotonin when it comes to depression, our favorite molecule, and start thinking about BDNF. This is my favorite brain molecule. I want it to be your favorite brain molecule. BDNF, it's not like it's a perfect biomarker, but I like it as an idea. What BDNF represents to me is hope. BDNF is a neurohormone that causes our brain to give birth to new brain cells. It causes our brain cells to like reach out and make more friends, communicate more to other brain cells. I like that. More brain cells, more brain connections. That's what the brain is made of. And anything that influences BDNF, and we know that medications, antidepressants do. We know that psychotherapy does. And we know that food does. And we know that exercise does. Anything that influences us in BDNF, I think, is something that we want to be thinking about as an idea of getting our brain in grow mode. And here's just a little illustration of the biochemical pathways of how a nutrient like zinc is related to BDNF. And the whole hope is to get our brain in these neuroplastic processes really going. This is one of the illustrations from Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety of showing really that neuroplasticity is involved in depression and dementia. And when we think about what gets in the way of us having a growing, healthy brain, this word inflammation gets thrown around a lot these days, right? Like everything's caused by inflammation. And it also turns out inflammation and neuroinflammation. The inflammation is like your body's alarm signal. So it's kind of, imagine you're trying to fall asleep and your fire alarm and your burglar alarm and your smoke alarm are all going off. Yeah, you'll probably fall asleep eventually, but you're gonna be really irritated for a while. That's kind of like too much inflammation. Inflammation interrupts cognitive circuits, it interrupts mood circuits, and it interrupts anxiety circuits. So you end up when you have an inflamed brain. And I was really surprised researching my book about this. I spoke with Roger McIntyre, a real expert in this, and he spoke about how these major sets of circuits get interrupted. And when we look at what causes inflammation, there's lots of things in our lives, but what we have control over is diet. And that's where it's really at the center of regulating the system. The other idea in this that's really important is the microbiome, because when you think about regulating inflammation and what you can do, besides getting rid of the foods that tend to cause more inflammatory factors in the body, you can also tune your microbiome. You can have microbiome are all the bacteria living in our gut, mostly in our colon. And the microbiome really, we're beginning to understand, plays a key and critical role to how our immune system and inflammatory systems work. Also, the microbiome is just in constant bidirectional communication with the brain. And also, it's 2021. We can't talk about brain health without saying microbiome at least once. I just put this slide in just to actually say the word. No, I'm kidding. So very quickly, we know food changed. And this is just quickly like how it changed. We went from whole food to processed food. We started eating sugars and refined carbohydrates. We did this with really good intention, right? We got to remember 1912, two fascinating things happened. We discovered the first vitamin. We're like, oh my gosh, there are these things in food, vitamins, and wow, they matter. And we isolated vitamin B1. Also in 1912, a man named Edward Kaiser, a German biochemist, came across the Atlantic Ocean with a little tiny vial of trans fats. It was cottonseed oil that he'd hydrogenated it in his lab. And he went to meet two brothers, Procter and Gamble, and he said, hey guys, we should take cottonseed oil and feed it. We should hydrogenate it and feed it to humans. And so it's an example of how we really shifted the types of fats we eat. And again, remember, your brain's made of fat, right? Fats are very metabolically active and interesting. I'll tell you a little story about how we changed the fats in our diet, but then just very quickly in doing that, we consume fewer omega-3 fats, we consume more omega-6 fats. Generally, the idea there is omega-3 fats tend to be anti-inflammatory, omega-6 fats a little more pro-inflammatory. And then we add all this new stuff to food, right? Food dyes, preservatives, we add in the trans fats that Edward Kaiser brought across the Atlantic Ocean. And the result of this is people start really not getting a set of fundamental nutrients that we've always gotten from food. Things like zinc and magnesium and folate, things that are quite prevalent in the right foods if you choose the right foods, quite prevalent in those power players that I mentioned. And then in terms of fats, I just wanted to highlight another one, another fat in terms of the omega-3, omega-6 kind of idea, just to show you how much things have changed. Soybean oil, 1,000-fold increase. Now, soybean oil is a whole lot of omega-6 fats. These are the ratio in pure. This is corn oil and sunflower oil. There are two other seed oils. Soybean oil is a little bit less than this, but it's a lot of omega-6 fats. And what's happened is our ratio, as we've eaten more soybean oil, more corn oil, more sunflower oil, the ratio of these fats has really shifted from Paleolithic diets. People estimate with like 1 to 10. And then here's what's happened. This is actually human fat samples. You can just see like our fat really changed. So if you think about fat as kind of being the foundation of your inflammatory response, and kind of like instead of having like those really, really nice, like let's say community police officers who know everybody, they're always settling things down, versus like having just nothing but SWAT team. Like they're always ready to take everyone out. It's a little bit like how maybe we've rigged our inflammatory system, at least in this theory of how omega-6 and omega-3 fats influence brain health. I just want to quickly go through some of the data here to share with you some of how we think about food influencing mental health. So quickly, this is a correlational study, looked at 10,000 university students, followed them for 4.5 years. And what the brackets show is the decrease in risk. If you ate like your Mediterranean, this was a Spanish study, your Spanish grandmother ate, you ate a Mediterranean diet, or you're at least in the top half of eaters. And that's what the numbers across the adherence to Mediterranean dietary pattern score, that's what those are across the top. You had a between a 30 and a 50% reduction in having depression over the next 4.5 years. Now imagine that if we could take away 30% of depression in college. That would be amazing for our public health. All of these prospective or all of these epidemiological studies, these correlational studies, of course, this doesn't prove causation, but just quickly what we see here is you end up about an 18.2% decrease in overall risk. And this is basically saying when you eat a more traditional dietary pattern, if you look at all of the data, you get about an 18% decreased risk in depression in that population. So again, really potentially, when we think that, boy, researchers estimate with exercising regularly, we could take away about 10% of adult depression. And this study is recommending or suggesting at least that traditional diets take away about 18% of depression. Again, it just becomes quite interesting. Also here correlationally, again, just eating a more traditional or a healthier dietary pattern means you have a bigger brain when you're older. Now, I like that. I like more brains. Now, let's quickly then talk about the randomized clinical trials that support the idea that food should be involved in our mental health care system and how we think individually about our mental health, and how somebody like me, who's a clinician, and Ronnie, who's a clinician, who talk to patients about, these are ways to take care of your brain. This was the first study, was an accident. They were looking for a control group for a psychotherapy study to help elderly folks with depression beat their depression. And their control group was talking about just basic diet and nutrition stuff. They just used some government handouts, not even my favorite brain foods, but helped with things that really impact elderly depression. They didn't know it at the time, but a study came out subsequently that showed food insecurity. So just not really feeling so secure about your food supply, where your next meal is going to come from, if you can afford food, that increases the risk of elderly depression by 10 times. What this study found is over 2 years, just talking with elderly individuals about their meal planning, helping them cook more meals at home, helping them budget, they reduced depression scores by 40 to 50%. Again, let's look at that from a public health standpoint. Just 5 hours over 2 years, and look what you get, less depressed elderly. But the best trial that's come out, it was published in 2018, the SMILES trial. This looked at 67 individuals. It followed them over 12 weeks and gave them 7 individual nutrition counseling sessions. It found that a full 32.3% of them right here went into full remission, compared with those who were in the placebo group. The placebo group got a social befriending group. So they still got to hang out, they ate crackers, they talked, they were nice to each other. But the control, the intervention group, where there was a nutritional counseling, found that the number needed to treat, this is a 4.1, means if I just talk to 4 patients with depression about the Mediterranean diet who are in some sort of treatment, I get one of them better completely. And when you compare that to like adding on a medication like a standard antidepressant treatment protocol, it'd be like, I don't know, some SSRI that doesn't totally work, like Zoloft or Prozac, you're doing pretty much better. We give you like a second generation antipsychotic like aripiprazole. So the number needed to treat of doing that intervention is 10. Whereas, so I have to treat 10 patients with aripiprazole to get them into full remission from depression versus the 4.1, at least according to this study. That study is then followed up by this is my favorite because this would just work for me every single time for my depression. Mediterranean style cooking class. Now I'm not sitting with some dietitian. Now I'm in a cooking class with some other depressed people, like olive oil tasting, making like lentils and salmon. That would be so good for my depression. It was a bigger trial too. 152 patients went through this one. They show depression scores improve with the Mediterranean diet. They also improve with the social group, but you can see that statistically significant difference. And this is what we see, by the way, in a lot of med trials, right? You give patients with depression placebo, about 30 to 40, sometimes 50% get better. Not that depression isn't a real illness, to just sometimes people see this, see the decrease in both and wonder why that is. So how does this work? So maybe people are taking care of some of those nutrient deficiencies that I mentioned earlier, or maybe they're triggering more BDNF and neuroplasticity because they're not eating as many processed foods. Maybe we're fighting inflammation by fueling the microbiome with more plants and more phytonutrients. And maybe it's just getting rid of the toxic effects of modern diet. There's no trans fats, or at least fewer food dyes. We don't have maybe as much medication load, that as patients feel better, maybe they're on a little bit of a lower dose, so they have fewer side effects. One way that this probably works is that the Mediterranean diet seems to buffer the effect of depression. This is a really interesting study, and I just want to kind of break it down. It took me a little while to understand this graph, but the reason I wanted to include it is interleukin-6 is a blood measure of inflammation. And so what we see here is that depressed versus non-depressed, like when you're depressed, you have extra inflammatory factors. And so there's a little almost chicken and egg thing, right? Is it depression causes more inflammation, or what does inflammation cause depression? And I just think we should elevate how we think about this to, like, in the real world, you know what? There's chickens and there's eggs. They're both there and they coexist. That when we're depressed, we have more inflammation. And also when we have more inflammatory factors, we know this from, for example, the treatment of hepatitis C involves interleukin, I think it's 1. And when you go into hepatitis C treatment with interleukin 1, we give you Zoloft before you even get the medicine, because we know 50% of patients are going to get depressed. So what we see here, though, is that eating a healthy diet, whether you're depressed or not depressed, it helps you buffer the inflammation of depression, right? So these patients, even when they're depressed, they have lower inflammatory factors. So then quickly, just to talk about what we do in our clinic, and then I look forward to talking with Ronnie about some questions, is we try and really talk with patients about what is brain food, to understand their dietary pattern, to think about nutrient density, and to think about not singular superfoods or supplements, but to think about your overall dietary pattern, how you access food, how you nourish yourself, what food means to you as an eater and as an individual. When I started talking with patients about food early in my career, I'd kind of hear this all the time. Like, hey, no, I eat healthy, I count calories, I don't eat cholesterol, I don't eat fat. Patients would look at me with a lot of pride. They don't eat red meat, of course. And then especially New Yorkers would kind of like give me a little wink and be like, don't worry, doc, I drink my 2 glasses of Cabernet every night for my brain health. And, when I looked at that, I just thought, really doesn't look like much fun to me. Not that you need to eat lots of red meat and fat, but just it doesn't seem like a good way to motivate people to take care of their brains. And I think it's much better for us to think about how we can joyfully nourish our brains. At this time in my career, also smartphones. I'm so old that when I trained, we didn't have smartphones. So smartphones came out and I was like, wow, patients are carrying around a camera all the time. Could you take pictures of everything you eat? And so one of my young patients with a really significant depression just recorded everything he ate. And this is what it looked like. And when you look at this, you kind of see what patients and physicians are up against. There are some okay brain foods in here. There's some scrambled eggs, right? There's some potatoes. I even see some green on those pulled pork tacos. But there's a whole lot of glucose, a whole lot of fake meat, a whole lot of fake food, and a whole lot of things missing that we would want when we're thinking about what would be ideal for this eater, given he has a significant depression. We would think about some nutrients we'd want him to be getting in that food. And that led Laura LaChance and I to create the Antidepressant Food Scale. We really ask a very simple question. We ask this question, hey, what are the nutrients that have the most evidence that they affect depression in the scientific literature? And we found there were 12. And we asked an even simpler question. According to USDA data, which foods have the most of those nutrients per calorie? And this is what we came up with. Then what you see here, and what's important is not to get like obsessed about the fact that you don't eat spleen or that you really don't like watercress. What's important here is to see the food categories. That's what this exercise really taught me. And especially after I was the king of kale for about 4 or 5 years, and then all the kale backlash, which that led to a lot of pain in my heart. But I really learned that what's important is leafy greens. And if you don't like kale, we can still be friends. You can still have an amazing and healthy brain. If you don't like kale, you already know that, right? But leafy greens themselves are probably a really great food category, and a food category most people get wrong, because when we think leafy greens, we think salads. We don't think soups, we don't think stews, we don't think sautés, we don't think smoothies. And so how to help people embrace these foods. And then in the animal foods, all nutrient profiling systems kind of lie to us, like the Andy and the Power Food, fruits and vegetables, all these other nutrient profiling systems, they rank like the top 1,000 foods, and you don't see a single piece of seafood or meat. And that's because meat and seafood have more calories. But the top animal foods are really interesting. Again, what groups here? And what you see are the bivalves, mussels, clams, and oysters. Right? You see seafood, you see wild meat, like goat is the #3 consumed meat in the world. Most people don't realize that, but very, very nutrient dense. You see fish roe, right? Where you see it makes a lot of sense that another diet that's tied to decreased risk of depression is a traditional Japanese diet. In our clinic, then we began to think, how can we spread this information? We created an e-course, Eat to Beat Depression, and that then led to this new book, Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety, where we want people to make this transition from nutrient into food. When I say zinc, I want you to think oysters and pumpkin seeds. And when you're thinking, gosh, I need some fiber, you're thinking beans and lentils. When you want omega-3 fats, it's not your fish oil pill, it's anchovies and sardines. That's the hope, because when we translate our nutrient needs into food, that's the beginning of food as medicine. That allows us to find some really exciting things like, top iron foods we often think of as meat. Well, what about clams? Also, clams are the top nutritional source of vitamin B12. Over 1,000% of your need of B12 is in 3 ounces of clams. Things like cashews, especially, this was really important in our house as we were having kids and my wife was breastfeeding. We were trying to get a lot of iron into the diet, as breast milk doesn't have a lot of iron. And we started chewing up cashews and feeding them to our kids pretty young. Again, iron in plants is going to be a non-heme iron, not quite as absorbable, although if you cook it or if you kind of help liberate the iron from the heme by acidifying it with like lemon juice, that can be helpful. And then, of course, dark chocolate, this isn't a marketing gimmick for my new book. This is because it's a great example of how we just are kind of twisted in how we think about food. The dark chocolate's an incredible brain food. My office behind me is actually filled with dark chocolate, as I've always mailing people chocolate bars and eating them myself. The reason is a great source of iron, magnesium, fiber, and then these really powerful flavonols and polyphenols. And just quickly, just to bop down to Costa Rica, this is the La Anita Rainforest Cacao Ranch, and just where cacao comes from. This little tiny flower here is what every chocolate bar you've ever eaten starts with the pollination of this tiny little flower. This is just a warning that you can't have too much cacao, and then suddenly you're really jazzed up watching your children jump off of platforms in the rainforest and go down zip lines, and you think this maybe wasn't the best idea. Chocolate is a fermented food. So this is when you break open that cacao pod, this is what you have inside. It's a little slimy and a little bit sweet. It ferments in these tubs as the little fruit flies from the rainforest fly out and kind of hang out on the sugars, distribute bacteria. It ferments, you then dry it. And that's my favorite way to get cacao nibs. But then also there's lots of science. This was a study by Scott Small at Columbia looking at 50 to 69-year-old subjects who consumed this high flavanol cacao drink. And it found to enhance dentate gyrus function. Dentate gyrus is a very specific brain structure involved in certain types of memories. They also would measure that by fMRI. And this was really the first time, I think, the first really molecule ever that's been shown to reverse age-related memory decline. One of the reasons dark chocolate's one of the power players and a focus of the book. Another thing we try and do, again, instead of just saying, remember that list, like no cholesterol, no fat, no red meat, like, Like, I like to hear what's on the menu, and I don't know, I feed kids, I feed a family. Like, I can't hear all that stuff. I need to hear, like, what should we put on our plates? And I think our patients and people deserve the same thing. There's not that you can't ever eat a hamburger ever again. Hamburgers are delicious. It's that you should work on getting a salmon burger in there. And maybe for every other hamburger you eat, if you start eating a salmon burger, wow, you really just changed the dial on how many omega-3 fats you're consuming every month. If you can take your cheese dip, swap it for guacamole, or not that you got to get rid of the French fries, but instead of some soybean oil laden spud, how about making some oven baked sweet potato fries with olive oil and sea salt? These are the types of simple swaps that we really think help. I've also got a new download on my website with more of these. Then I just quickly to think about food in terms of evolution, right? Where did the human brain come from? When we look at the Horn of Africa, where we think the human brain evolved, it wasn't a grassland, which it is now, it was a shoreline. And the reasoning or the idea behind that with evolutionary biologists is that there are certain foods that have a lot of omega-3 fats and a lot of minerals. And we think those really being in a nutritional milieu with a lot of those helped the human brain evolve. A good example of that is the oyster. Remember, that was at the top of the antidepressant food scale, interestingly enough. 6 oysters, how many calories? Just 60 calories. Now just think about that for a second and look at all the nutrients you get. Remember zinc, which about half of Americans don't get every day? Well, 6 oysters, you get enough for 5 days. A third of your iron, right? 2.5 days worth of B12. And by the way, B12 you store in your liver for 3 to 5 years, or at least you have a 3 to 5 year supply usually. And also lots of long-chain omega-3 fats. It's just nice to have some place to get them besides wild salmon and anchovies. Now quickly, why do we care about these? Now, this is where the omega-3 fats, how they get into the neuronal membrane. And when they're there, there's some idea that the sodium potassium channels that kind of run a lot of the electricity of our brain just work a little better. Omega-3 fats are one of those nutrients in food that goes, because it's a fat, doesn't need to be transported. It kind of glides all the way from the end of your fork into your gut, gets absorbed in your bloodstream, up into your brain, and lo and behold, it gets all the way into the nucleus of those cells and influences BDNF expression, increasing it. And so it's kind of interesting to think about, again, the choices we have in front of us that you can take in a molecule that really, if you were going to design a medication, hey, this is going to like be a part of your brain cells and make them stronger. And like, ooh, wow, it's going to do all these crazy functions in your brain, like give rise to this family of molecules called resolvins that literally just kind of keep brain cells alive and help them. And wow, it's also going to like turn on this gene in your brain that makes your brain, I mean, if you were like going to, you couldn't come up with a better marketing idea for a brain molecule. And that's what omega-3 fats are. And it leads to this question, where to find them and what's the perfect fish? And I think it's kind of simple. Again, I'm a bit of a farm boy, right? We're trying to avoid mercury, which really just means avoiding big fish. Avoid king mackerel, avoid shark, avoid tilefish, and look for fish that have fatty cold water fish that just have more of these long-chain omega-3 fats. And here are some of my favorites: salmon, herring, sardines, anchovies, wild salmon. People talk about budgeting. Look, I think salmon's a great deal. This is salmon on sale, $10 a pound. So for $10, I'm feeding my entire family one of the healthiest brain foods on the planet. And then also, I have this can of salmon here with me, just to say canned salmon, because the wild salmon burgers in my new book are one of my favorite recipes. It's one that my kids love. We just had them last night. And to see your children devouring wild salmon, oh boy, that's a treat as a parent. So there's lots of ways to do this on every budget, and at least in my opinion. And I'm talking to you now from rural Indiana. I get a lot of this food at Walmart. And so you don't have to be near a fancy gourmet grocery store to feed your brain. This is Rocket Pie from my last book, Eat Complete, which is a cookbook with 100 recipes. Rocket Pie is a clam pie, so each slice of pie there gives you over 200% of your daily need of vitamin B12. This is my happy place where I go in my mind when I'm feeling tense. This is the largest kale field in America. It's just about enough kale to satisfy me. This is an interesting picture. I just want to share this for a couple of reasons. One is that in between the kale is actually the most nutrient green, dense green on the planet. It's called purslane. It has more omega-3 or plant-based omega-3 fats than really anything other than some algae. And it's just interesting to think about our food supply, right? That this healthy green that basically gets tilled back in, and we pull the kale. And when you have a small farm or small garden, purslane, if you see it come up, absolutely delicious, citrusy green. This was the first clinical trial I conducted using kale to treat depression in Yale graduate students. We give them these t-shirts and bundles of kale, and about 85%, I'm teasing, this is just a picture of Yale students in kale shirts. The Yale Sustainable Food Project is where this kale shirt originally came from. Just wanted to share that. And it does kind of speak to an important note I just want to say, and part of the new book, which is really talking beyond kale and its nutrients and thinking about what's happening in this picture, that as people grow food together, as people harvest food together, as we share food with one another, that feels really good. And that part of the antidepressant effect of food is beyond all this fancy science. Part of it, and everyone watching knows this, part of it is how we connect with people we love and care about, and why food is so important. It's one of the reasons I'm against supplements is like, I've just never had a romantic date over a bowl of supplements, but I have had a lot of wonderful dates over delicious food. Kale and all of my work in kale, we launched National Kale Day. I wrote 50 Shades of Kale. It led me to this kind of idea that brain foods tend to have three really important characteristics. They're nutrient dense, like kale and oysters. You can do a lot of things with them, right? Maybe you don't think you can do a lot of things with kale. Trust me, you can. I wrote a cookbook. You can make kale soup. You can make kale chips, which are amazing. You put it in a smoothie, and anything you add it to, you're going to bump up the nutrient density. I think kale is a good example of food that you kind of get anywhere on the planet. Certainly some of my favorite brain foods, I'm not going to find local anchovies here in rural Indiana, but I am going to find a lot of really amazing brain foods, and focusing on finding some local foods important. I'm going to just finish up with a couple other food categories: nuts, beans, and seeds. Really love these, especially nuts as a snack. Nuts got more nutrient dense. The USDA issued a statement a few years back saying like, whoops, we kind of got it wrong in the bomb calorimeter. To be honest, you don't absorb all of the calories in nuts. And so when you look at the caloric content of nuts, you can take about 25% off. But I just say that because a lot of times when I recommend nuts, people say, oh, aren't they full of fat? Aren't they going to cause weight gain? And again, look what you're getting for those calories. And on top of that, I would argue snacking on fat and protein and fiber is really one of the healthiest ways for you to snack, because it's going to keep you full. Beans and legumes, lentils, just look at that. 90% of your folate in a cup of lentils, plus 67% of your fiber, again, feeding the microbiome with the fiber, and getting lots of iron. Again, when you're thinking about brain nutrients, lentils, maybe something that's not in your cupboard, in your diet. If you didn't eat lentils this week, maybe that's a good one for you to think about. This is French onion soup from Eat Complete, because I like France, I like cheese, and I like onions. And they said this was my cookbook, and I was like, fresh onion soup. And then it's like, well, there's no nutrition in there really. And so we added a can of white beans, and suddenly it becomes a really incredibly nutrient-dense stew. Now, eating your colors, now there's a lot of stuff to eat, and you hear this, and I love this idea of eat your colors, eat the rainbow. It's a great idea. All of the different colors represent different flavonoids, different phytonutrients. You should think about those not really just as antioxidants. I would think of them, if I were you, as signaling molecules. How they turn on genes. They tend to turn on genes that fight inflammation. There is one warning, and just as you eat these rainbow colors, and I just say this because, all interventions comes with risk and benefits. So the benefits of this: fighting inflammation, feeling amazing. The risks, and it might happen to you if you eat a lot of rainbow vegetables, it begins feeling as like a little bit of a tingling kind of in the chest. And then eventually what you'll feel, and if you're not expecting it's quite scary, is rainbow finger. It's a very well-defined medical condition for individuals who eat too many rainbow vegetables. So just, you've been warned. Fermented foods. Fermented foods are part of every traditional dietary pattern. And the reason this is how we stored food, it also kind of speaks all the way back to how we're so intimately tied with bacteria. Like, I was shocked the first time I made sauerkraut. I'm like, where's the starter, right? There's no starter. You just chop up cabbage, organic cabbage ideally, mix it with salt, scrunch it together, put it in a jar, and it starts fermenting, because the bacteria is all over there. Remember that moment in medical school, Ronnie? I'm not sure you remember this one, when all the doctors watching, when your pathology professor, like, kind of gleefully said ours was like, well, you're covered in a layer of bacteria at all times, right? You all know that. And you see like every medical student start to freak out a little bit. But it is true. We're covered in bacteria, and medicine has evolved. We're not trying to kill it anymore. This is a lining of your colon, just because it's a really important part of you we don't talk about. These little villi that reach up, and they absorb really so much of the nutrients we need. And there's increasing data between this communication between our vagus nerve, this big nerve that runs from our brain to our gut. We're not going to have time to get into this today. I just wanted to end with this, which is just, it's a whole new frontier in mental health. Not that taking a probiotic is going to cure your depression, but boy, every single patient I treat with bipolar disorder, I take care of their microbiome now based on this study that came out in 2018. That they took individuals hospitalized from mania and just did a straight up placebo versus probiotic trial in addition to regular treatment. But what they found is that the people with probiotics who had high inflammatory factors in their blood had a 90% decreased rehospitalization rate at 6 months compared to people who got placebo. So just kind of fascinating data coming out of the microbiome world. So I hope you hear that along with my pharmacy and as a New York City psychiatrist, all of the medicines I have and all of the interpretations about your mother that I'd love to make, there's also this farm pharmacy, this farm traditional whole foods. These are the power players, and we didn't talk about all these foods, but I hope it makes sense why these are on the list now, that they're not just some arbitrary foods, and I'm not just trying to get people to buy my book because there's dark chocolate on the list, but they're really there because of their nutrient density, the phytonutrients, and the specific nutrients they bring. I hope now you think that maybe you can eat to build a better brain. And I hope that some of this data compels you to think about putting your brain in brain grow mode, thinking about these new concepts and how they apply to mental health, neuroplasticity, and inflammation. I hope you're not going to be scared of fish anymore, and that you see some of the data that I've shown in terms of Mediterranean dietary patterns and whole food dietary patterns really seeming to influence depression and anxiety, both risk and outcome when it comes to clinical trials. And that if we put the genie back in the bottle, really think about food in a historical context, not that we don't want to keep evolving as eaters. I think there is the argument that we've never gone backwards like this. So there is something about the whole Paleolithic diet that I don't know. I'm not planning on being a caveman. I'm planning on being a modern man. So I'm going to eat like that. But there is something about highly processed foods that really has done a number on us. And to put the genie back in the bottle, I think would do great things for your mental health. Mostly, I hope you hear my encouragement and the encouragement of everyone here at the Aspen Brain Center to feed your mental health, and that it's one of the biggest levers you have in terms of helping with conditions like dementia, depression, and anxiety. Not the only thing that we need to do, but that it's a really important and missing factor. I hope we're doing a bunch of brain food challenges. I hope you'll join them, mostly on Instagram. The Brain Food Clinic is a fully digital mental health clinic. We have a weekly Friday Feels newsletter, and we also have a clinician training program. You can find out information about all of this along with some of the downloads I mentioned on drewramseymd.com. And I have a lot of fun on Instagram. So I'm at drewramseymd there, and I look forward to engaging with any of you. And I look forward to your questions and talking with Ronnie. And thank you all so much for your attention.
Drew, where to begin? Drew, you are indeed a modern man. And you are also an extraordinary storyteller with a very compelling story. Drew, nobody has ever given me the rainbow finger. I knew this something was missing.
It feels so good, right, Ronnie?
And my heart, Drew, does ache for you as the deposed king of kale, but we will always have chocolate, oysters, and I love the image of the family and enjoying an evening meal of wild salmon burgers.
Wild salmon burgers, and Ronnie, I guess together you can help me live beyond the kale, right? So I'll look forward to your help with that.
You're never going to live that down, kid. So about storytelling, tell us the story, your story about your path to creating what is essentially a new field, nutritional psychiatry. You began your postgraduate training, your residency training in a rich but traditional program at Columbia University, and have evolved to the status truly of a pioneer. What are some of the personal and professional catalysts to this development?
think a lot of analysis helped, a lot of psychoanalysis. Ronnie, that's very nice. And
Sure.
I just want to thank you for those very kind comments. And I think I've been very fortunate to have the support of a very, in some ways, conventional place and also a very cutting edge place. Columbia Psychiatry has really always pushed me to hold a standard of evidence and also to be responsible in what I say when it comes to how people should take care of their mental health. I also think there's something about training at Columbia where there is a real emphasis on empowering patients. And so I think all of that came together for me. I guess years ago when I was in college, I was a low-fat vegetarian. I was an athlete in college. I was a pole vaulter of all things and played basketball, being a good Hoosier. And was really interested in my personal health and fitness and wellness. And it was just interesting to me going to medical school where I don't know, I was in medical school in 1996. There were like no vegetarians in medical school. That was super weird. And to be an athlete, I remember being on the track team, and I was like, you're the only vegetarian. And that's not how I eat now. And it's not really how I recommend to eat. But I certainly went into residency with that mindset. And so as data started coming out about dietary patterns, about omega-3 fats, and about fish oil and its potential use as an antidepressant, it just got me really curious. And then I think this should all be seen in the context of my parents were hippies that moved to rural Indiana and bought a farm. And I grew up in a really, really rural existence, and all of the good and all of the challenges that come with that. And so I think that certainly also informs how I think about mental health. Certainly over the past 5 or 6 years, as my wife and 2 kids and I have been mostly living in rural Indiana, kind of mixed between there and New York. It's just been really fascinating to learn more about food and growing food, to grow more of our own food, to wake up every morning with the sunrise and go to bed early, as opposed to our city living, which was an urban existence. We lived in New York for I guess almost 20 years, and so I hope that sums up my personal story. I mean, I guess the part that's important, Ronnie, to me is that it struck me as really weird that in mental health and psychiatry, we take care of the organ that eats the most food, but we never talk about food. It struck me as really weird that we give a bunch of medicines that often cause changes in weight and appetite, but we never got taught to take a dietary history. We never got taught to help understand patients from a nutritional perspective. And we've never been taught about the power of nutrition. And part of that is because the data didn't exist, but part of that is just a huge miss. And so I just think as this movement has gained some speed, I've gone from being really fearful and anxious and worried that I'm going to be kicked out. I remember the first time I presented at the American Psychiatric Association. I mean, it was terrifying. And then you look out and the room was overflow. They called the fire marshal on us. And then the next year we presented where there were 400 people in the room. And afterwards, someone came up and said, we got a list of emails of everybody else who wanted the information. And I thought she was joking, and the list had 200 emails on it. And it was like, oh my goodness. And so then I think you move past the kind of cliche of what mental health and psychiatry is and into the reality that psychiatry is evolving rapidly, right? That our colleagues are diverse, that we have, I think, more focus on equanimity and on diversity in mental health and psychiatry. We've been sensitized to that because of what we do. And so it's been a really exciting time. I feel really blessed that I've gotten to be part of it most of all.
Well, it's an interesting point you make about being part of the club, because, and you allude to this, Drew, being part of the club means writing, or has meant historically, writing those prescriptions for medications that are likely to cause a 30 or 40 or 50 pound weight gain in someone who is already in phenomenal psychic pain, and the pain for you as the practitioner.
I can say that this is really good for you, and I certainly appreciate risk-benefit ratios, and I certainly appreciate some people have to be on some of these medicines, but even in that case, okay, then we've got to really help them take optimal care of their metabolic health. We can't just say, well, that's for the primary care doctor, or that's for the nutritionist.
Yeah. Drew, again, you present a very compelling and accessible approach to mental and physical wellness. What are some of the obstacles systemically to implementation?
I think there are a couple that stand out to me right now, Ronnie. I think one is there's become such a powerful and I would say negative tone in how we respect one another and approach ideas. And so, there's sort of not a notion that there's not a notion which is true in the debate, which is there are lots of ways to feed the human brain. There aren't lots of sources of things like omega-3 fats or B12, but there are lots of people who've done really well on a variety of dietary patterns in terms of finding human happiness. So I think one is kind of a big barrier that people fail is the current diet culture, which is really kind of looking towards a set of either silver bullets or unknown pieces of information, or almost like there's this kind of like FOMO feel constantly, like how you're eating must be wrong. Let me tell you, something's about to, here's a new piece. He only dropped this new piece of knowledge on you. I think there's that. I think for some folks, there's just access, right? This all sounds great, but you go to a local store and there aren't these foods, or it's what prescribing the Mediterranean diet's like, why that doesn't really work. I can say like, hey, Ronnie, eat the Mediterranean diet. But like, I'm here in rural Indiana. That means like pasta, pizza, like lamb hero, like that's the Mediterranean diet. And so how we help break down those dietary patterns and then translate them to people and help them have access, I think that is certainly a barrier. I think we've lost some of our culture of independence when it comes to nourishing ourselves. And we look at the growth and how much we really love. I think it's kind of Oedipal, Ronnie, since we're shrinks. It's like we all really just want to be taken care of by some ideal mommy who feeds us perfect tasting food. And the food industry has really tried to be that perfect breast for us, right? It's just sweet. It's just crunchy enough. I can't quite get enough of it. It's like the best mother's milk you can imagine, except, of course, it makes you super sick. That's where it's different. But besides,
it makes you super sick.
And so I think there's that, there is that. I don't like pointing the finger at big food because I think big food is doing just what big food is designed to do. Their goal is to make cheap food as accessible as possible and as delicious as possible. And that's what they do really well. It's
you made the I'm interrupting because it's just too delectable and too seductive not to we on the one hand we don't want to point fingers, we have to control what we can, but these are mighty powerful forces. And as you also pointed out in your more formal presentation, so many of these factors these are invisible enemies, if you will. How can individuals take a stand or fight back?
Roasted vegetables, that's like my number one go-to. I think we fight back oven roasted vegetables. It doesn't get, first of all, there's the mindful and meditative quality of chopping up some plant. It really doesn't freaking matter. It could be a carrot, it could be, we got some fennel bulbs in the house right now. I don't know why, just saw them. We've been chopping up cabbages, olive oil, sea salt, drop it in the oven at 400 degrees, pull it out when it smells good. It's like 15, 20 minutes, put it under the broiler if you want a little char on there. That's how I think we battle. That tastes delicious. I crave that every day. I guess I'm being a little silly, but I think the way that we fight it, Ronnie, is in our kitchens. And I think the way we fight it is as individuals and as communities, that we're not going to engage in certain behaviors that have been quote unquote American, like stop drinking soda. That just causes horrible problems for your health. Like stop eating things where you open the package, or maybe don't stop entirely. I ate a Snickers bar the other day. You don't have to stop entirely. I'm going to have a beer tonight to celebrate, right? It's Friday, but that we want to have that not to be the basis of our dietary pattern. And we want.
Drew, I have an eye on the clock and it is intolerable to me because there's so much to discuss. And, you are a nutritional psychiatrist. in part at least. I am a genetic psychiatrist, and the natural intersection of our work is the field of epigenetics, which you write about in your book. Let me share a very brief definition for our audience of epigenetics: the interaction of our genes with internal and external environments, how we live our lives, the choices we make, including and especially, as you point out, Drew, what we eat, turn our genes on and off. And nutrition certainly is one way to introduce epigenetics to our patients. How do we broaden their exposure to incorporate other aspects of an optimized epigenome, deep rest, quality sleep, stress reduction, mindfulness, social connections, spirituality, and you alluded to this some, but what's the gateway in?
Well, I think it's one of the reasons that I like food, is it feels like, in sleep, those are things that we do every day, and that, often we have that feeling like there's more that we could be doing, that we should be taking, and so I think the path in is a commitment to self-care, and I think a lot of, here at the end of the talk, if we want to get down to brass tacks, Ronnie, I think that we've been indoctrinated into a culture where we really don't like ourselves very much. We feed ourselves garbage. We don't sleep. We spend a lot of time on our screens because we're really, really in need of attention. And we love the attention the screen gives us. And I think we're at a really, really important point that, not that we can't have technology or modern foods or active lives. Like we all love that aspect of the modern world. I love everything I get done on my phone. I love the interconnectedness of the new digital world. I think it's fascinating, but there's also a way that a lot of us have been pulled in and indoctrinated into a world where we're always #too busy, and especially pre-pandemic. And that's what I remember that point in the phone call when you finally get to talk to them, not even, text message chain, email, when it's time to let's plan. I remember dreading it. Good God, I don't want to plan. I love you, whoever you are. I want to see you in 2 months, but the last thing I want to do is try and look in the calendar. And I think a lot of people watching remember that, right? We're just so kind of tied up with things. And so I think the place to start with is really putting, as they say, first things first, but not to be selfish, but to really commit to taking care of the self, and to commit to be more active in the care of the mental health. Right? Mental health to me, I'm a pretty straightforward shrink. I think about you in terms of connections. When you come to see me, if you want to know what I'm thinking about, I'm wondering how's this person connected up? How are they connected up internally? How do they process the world and think about it? How are they connected up in terms of their inner circle, the loved ones in their lives? And then how are they connected up to the greater world? So that kind of connection to inner passion, connection to immediate network, and then connected to their kind of bigger role in society. So maybe that doesn't sound like a first step, but to me, it feels like that is the well from which it all flows.
Well, interesting in terms of self-care. So we're poised at this extraordinary moment in time when we see some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of COVID and the remarkable advent of these various vaccines. Having said that, however, I read recently the pretty stunning results of an American Psychological Association poll in which they surveyed 3,000 plus adults, 42% of whom reported that they gained weight. And Drew, this number is deeply disturbing, an average of 29 pandemic pounds, thus increasing their COVID risk, in addition to all the other related health risks of obesity.
I was one of them. I went to my all-time high lifetime weight. I've always weighed about 185 to 190 pounds my entire life since I was a college athlete. Haven't really counted calories, just tried to eat whole foods. I've gone up and down a little bit here, but never weighed more than 198 pounds. And during the pandemic, I just popped right up to 220. And I remember I started gaining weight at one point. Every time I got on the scale, it scared me. I thought as a physician, like something's got to be wrong. Like I didn't eat that much today. Like something's wrong. So I think it is scary. I think a couple of things are just going to happen. First, as soon as the light at this end of the tunnel becomes the sunbeam on the beach we've all been hoping for, where we can dance and hug and be out amongst each other, those pounds are going to just fall right off, because that's what's happened to me. I got vaccinated about 2 months ago, and I'd already kind of started to do a little bit of a better job. It was pretty obvious my weight gain was coming from just, I was stress eating foods. I was drinking a little too much. But mostly I wasn't active. I was just sitting all day. So I got a little more active. My wife was really worried about my mental health. And so she talked to an expert in emotional support animals that said the way you're supposed to find the size of the person's pain and match it to the animal. So she bought me an 18-hand, 2,000-pound horse. And she said, she looked at me, she said, "Sweetie, I really want you to know I know you and I love you." And at first I was a little hurt. I was like, "Sweetie, it's not that bad." But then I got on the horse, and let me tell you, Ronnie, I feel amazing. She really knew me. It's helped a lot.
Drew, I have to say, it's extraordinarily generous of you to share those numbers with us, not the weight of the animal, but yours.
I had to lose weight for the animal too. It's like got very motivating. It's like a new girlfriend. I was like, "Sweetie, I don't want to waste it. Like you don't want your, big Drew to be like,
well,
you're make the difference. It's like 20 pounds.
You're humanizing all this, and it's, as you well know, it's too easy to idealize an extraordinary author and speaker and wise man such as yourself. So thank you for that. And you must have read my mind, because I was going to ask you my final question. I know we're trying to beat the clock here. Tell us about the horse.
Okay. You want to hear about my horse? So I've always, when I was a young guy, we had horses on the farm, but when we moved out to Indiana, one of the activities we found that was really just top quality is a local trainer had a really wonderful horse farm. And what I like about it for our daughter is the equestrian world is a very, in some ways, matriarchal world. You go to a horse show, it's all women. And I just thought for our daughter, I really wanted her to have places like that. And in addition to that, it just gives you such, in some ways, a perfect mental health workout for me, or a perfect kind of middle-aged dad workout, that it's really hard physically, and it's hard in a way that commands my attention. Unlike going for a jog or going for a swim or a healthy walk or a yoga class, the horse brings and focuses in my mind like nothing else. I find this tension between fear and mastery to be constant. That I will go get my horse Cinco, and even though I really adore him, there's always he's a spooky horse. He's a big boy. And then that feeling of being on him in a perfect flow of a beautiful canter down the home stretch, where you're in this just wonderful flow state with this huge, beautiful creature. And so I appreciate, I think, Ronnie, what I've learned in my own kind of journey as a man is that, our true strength doesn't come in anywhere close to what people tell men it should come from. That we're told to avoid vulnerability. We're told to, kind of try and be secure in what we know. And what I really found totally differently is that the more vulnerable and open I become about my own challenges, and the more open I become about my own work, just the more confident and the stronger I feel. And so it feels good to share all that stuff, because, that's just my truth. I gained weight. I've lost some of it. I haven't lost all of it. It's not really how I measure my health, but I hope it helps people see that, things go up and down in our lives, and that I hope the motivation of we all keep kind of steering towards progress is what gets us across the finish line eventually.
Well, and you're also evidencing and demonstrating self-kindness too. It happened, and God bless, you're alive and well, and yeah. What you didn't state, however, about your horse is his name.
Cinco is his name. Cinco is a really wonderful and well-bred warm blood that I really have no business owning. He's way too sweet, well-trained, and wonderful. But but he's ended up in my possession, and we've got our first show in a couple of weeks, and so.
And we want, we all want to see pictures. And
Ronnie, you should actually be concerned at my way. I've formed somewhat of an alter ego called Romatelli, which is this, I don't know, quite rambunctious Italian jumper who occasionally emerges with a quite thick Italian accent and to entertain my children. And so
eating only the Mediterranean diet.
Of course, Romatelli eats a Mediterranean diet.
The dreaded thing happened. You heard the timer go off a few moments ago, and that is having a loud sound in the middle of a Zoom call is second only to having one's kittens appear.
I like the cats. I like the cats, the dogs, the loud babies. I love that about
Bring them on. Bring them on.
But Ronnie, you, as a wise psychiatrist, knows that all good sessions come to an end.
Yes, sir. And let me close by saying, Dr. Drew, you are a nutritionally dense, brain healthy, epigenetic intervention for us all. And that, sir, is meant as a truly great compliment. We wish you every great success with your new book and look forward to your next visit with us and the continuing conversation very, very, very soon. And to our loyal global audience, we invite you to visit our website, aspenbraininstitute.org, for more information about Drew's book, as well as all ABI recordings, summaries, resources, and scheduled events. And thank you all.